just want to take a moment to introduce Anna Czarnik-Neimeyer, founder and CEO of Bridgebuilder Consulting. Anna's a longtime friend of AEE. She's a facilitator, consultant, writer, speaker, activist, experiential educator, and has had a very busy year touring around the entire world, doing some social justice work, working towards positive change, and we're very thankful for that, Anna. And I actually had the privilege of seeing a workshop based on this at our Heartland Regional Conference up in Wisconsin. I was really impressed with Anna's ability to bravely take the group to some uncomfortable places, which often happens in social justice work, and did it with great skill, and really managed our emotional safety, managed the risk in that environment very well. So can't think of anyone better to be presenting on this topic today. We're really excited to have you, Anna, and I'll go ahead and pass it on over to you.
Thanks a lot, Dan. I'm thrilled to be here, and hello everyone out in webinar land. I'd like to just get started by inviting you all to type a little hello into the chat space. I want to help cultivate that space because this is, as Dan mentioned, meant to be an interactive presentation. I will have my eye on the chat. And also occasionally throughout the webinar, I'll ask for you to reflect on something or to respond to the group. So what I always start with in webinars like this and in presentations is the why. And so while I'm talking about my why for you, I invite each of you in the chat section to type in your why. Why is it, in a sentence or two, a free written sentence or two, why is it that this is the webinar that you chose today? You took time out of your day, out of your busy schedules. Thank you for that. So I'm going to start a bit about my why, and also kind of a wider systemic why we have these conversations. And then we'll go back to you and what you're sharing. So about me, why do I do this work? I do this work because, plain and simple, I believe in bridging divisions across difference. And I don't think I need to explain to each of you what I mean by divisions. We're feeling it in our country. I have a huge family that ranges the political and ideological spectrum. I feel divisions even within that family in my home state of Wisconsin, which is a swing state, and also in our country and our world in general. I also grew up in multiple perspectives in a really big family that had a huge range of ideas about how the world should be. Some of them were nonprofit leaders, some of them were military leaders. And also my dad is a camp director, and so I grew up in rural settings in the summer and urban settings in the year. And so I do this work because I believe and have seen that if we have brave conversations, if we're courageous, then movement can happen. And so I'm hearing a lot from you coming in from all over the country. I see they're teaching a social justice. Michael's teaching a social justice class. Jenny is a pastor, and the church is a place where these conversations can happen. Another person named Anna is saying that we can be braver in the world today. And I agree with all of those things. So a bit about me. And then we'll get started, we'll dig in together. So I talk about myself, not because this presentation is about myself, but because each of us who are here today really are vehicles for the thing that we want to happen, which is social justice and social change. And so I always say to pastors, to teachers, to corporate leaders that I work with, if we promote our organizations and our companies, that's one vehicle for social change to happen. And so that's why I talk about myself really as a vehicle or a channel for this education. So I identify sort of in 4 areas, as Dan mentioned. I'm a writer, an experiential educator, a business owner and social entrepreneur, and a scholar. So in the writer realm, I write for places like Ms. Magazine, Teaching Tolerance through the Southern Poverty Law Center, Parker Palmer's Center for Courage and Renewal, and I'm also an editor at a space called Religious Response, which is a justice-based publication. As Dan mentioned, I'm an experiential educator, as are all of you. And so that means that I get to do social justice trainings. I work with AEE. Through that, I present at AEE. I also sit on the board of an organization called Out There Adventures, which organizes LGBTQ leadership experiences in the outdoors and adventure setting for youth. Third is that I'm a business owner and a social entrepreneur. So as Dan mentioned, I run this business called Bridgebuilder Consulting, which again is meant to bridge divisions between organizations that might not necessarily be talking with each other. So right now, my June project is working with churches to do LGBTQ ally trainings. And finally, which you'll see today, I'm also a scholar. So I came up through this information out of higher education realm. And so I helped start an inclusion and diversity center at a college. And I also do research on what best practices are to do social justice trainings. No matter what organization you're in right now, I see some people from churches, I see some folks doing citizenship programs in schools. There are clearly some people from organizations like corporations. You're meant to be here today. Whoever's in this space today is meant to be here today. So we're going to move relatively quickly through this because I want to give you as much information as I can. And also I am going to leave time at the end for questions. And so what I will ask of you as I'm reading through your chat now, as you have questions, feel free to type them out. And feel free to do that in kind of an uncensored way, bravely and courageously. So what I always do when we start with this is the why. We have 4 goals today, talking about the why of this. We'll be talking about some theory, and by theory, I mean books, scholars, activities, different models that you can take a look at that will help prime the pump for you to actually create your own trainings, because you can Google all sorts of activities, but what I can help give you is I can round up some of the theory that's happening right now, some of the cutting edge content in the field so that you can create your own trainings because you're all incredibly competent already. And then finally, at the end, we'll have some time for questions. So again, starting with the why, we talked a bit about why each of you are here, but I want to talk a bit about sort of a systemic why of why we do social justice training and why I'm talking about risk and bravery in that. For those of us who have been part of the social justice realm for a while, there are sort of 4 areas that I give for people of why we should be having social justice conversations. And I work in sustainable business as well, and sometimes it takes a bit more for either donors or corporations to be convinced of why we should be doing this. So the first part of why is, of course, the ethical sense. People are doing lots of movement right now with things from Black Lives Matter to the Women's March on Washington to addressing immigrant issues. So ethics is a clear and simple way to say it's the right thing to do. We all deserve a place at the table and in the conversation. But that's also not always social sustainability, which is making sure that orgs are ethical, that their employees are loyal to them. And also, we're seeing an uptick right now, at least in the country, that people are wanting to invest in organizations that are seen as socially responsible, from Target to even brands like Miller Lite, who are advertising at places like Pride Parades. It's becoming a business case for diversity. The third piece I'll talk about is personal element, which I'm going to talk about rather heavily today because with the bravery and the courage piece in social justice trainings, we're going to talk a bit about empathy. And the personal sense, the personal why for this is because especially as trainers, when we do self-examination, we understand that we are in fact part of a larger system, and sometimes those are oppressive systems. And so there's actually personal incentive for people in these trainings to not be part of that problem or to work against being part of that problem. And the fourth piece of the why is what I call mandates, which is simply that there are some laws and regulations that require social justice training. For instance, in higher education land, and in education land in general, in 2013, there was an update to the Violence Against Women Act, which President Obama at the time signed, which mandated that there be preventative education trainings at colleges and universities, and really any school that is receiving Title IX funding, to not only address issues after they happen, but to have preventative programs. And so I've seen an uptick in requests for trainings like this because they're required, and frankly, they do prevent negative instances from happening. And so those 4 areas are kind of the pragmatic why. The personal ethics, it's the right thing to do. The fiscal and social sustainability, there's a business case for diversity and inclusion trainings. The personal element of finding out that we're part of a system and addressing that. And then also legal mandates that we actually have to be doing these trainings. So now is a time for you to add in, and I'll take a look as well for other reasons why you are doing this at this particular point, and particular issues. I'd like to hear about particular issues that you're addressing or concerns that you have in your own trainings. And also, I'm interested in hearing about who are the people that you are sort of responsible for giving rationale to. Like, who are the decision makers in your realm? Because this will help me for you to provide a case for why we're having these trainings. So again, if you could type in who are the decision makers, and who are some of the factors that you're having to convince in your worlds, and I'll look for those coming in. So I say here, tension begs for theory. So one of the things that in my research I've been noticing is that in a lot of organizations, there are many people who are excellent facilitators, and this is true in Association for Experiential Ed, and in many of the education settings that I've trained in. There are many people who are excellent facilitators and excellent educators. And then there are also people who are content experts, meaning they're trained in identity studies or critical anti-racism, women's and gender studies. And those worlds are not necessarily always crossing paths, right? So we might have people who are excellent facilitators, but they don't necessarily have the content down. We have people who are excellent content experts, but they don't necessarily have the facilitation or the experiential techniques down. I'm starting to see some answers coming in. Folks are saying they're responsible to boards of regents, to legislators, they're responsible to committees for inclusion and diversity, county board members, schools. And I'm glad to hear these things because after this webinar, I'll be able to provide you with the resources and the research on this. So if you're responsible for saying, look, here's why we're doing this training and here's how I'm doing it, then you'll be able to kind of provide some of that official rationale to people. So thanks, and please keep them coming in. And also any challenges that you've had in terms of trainings that you've offered in the past or that you anticipate in the future. And so I'm going to keep going. So again, there's this tension between folks who are excellent facilitators but don't necessarily have the content knowledge, and content experts who maybe don't have as much experience in facilitation. And so what I do with Bridgebuilder Consulting and just in general is I say, look, there are actually ways to bridge these worlds. And that's why I say this tension begs for theory. It begs for an answer or for tools to be able to bridge these two worlds. And so that's really possible. And so we're going to go into that. So again, we talked about our why these trainings are important, why we are each individually here, our beliefs and values. And now we'll talk about part 2, which is theory. So today I'm going to present you with 4 practical theories. And again, as I see who you're responsible to in this training, I think that these are going to help for you because especially if we're being funded by places, if we're asked to do assessment, these are often elements that we can include. We can say, look, I'm not just making these things up. Some of this is tested. And the other thing that I want to say about theory is sometimes people feel like, you know, I don't have a degree in this, I can't use theory, or this is intimidating for me. And what I always say related to theory is that the beauty of theory is that it helps us to be not alone. To say, look, there are other people that are doing this work with me. And in fact, they've written about it, and I don't have to reinvent the wheel. And so when I think about theory, I don't think about, oh, I have to learn this new complex concept that's not familiar to me. I think, wow, I'm actually sitting in the room. I picture myself, as an experiential educator, I picture myself in the room with these theorists. So even if I'm doing a training alone, like I'm alone in this room right now, presenting this webinar to you, I picture myself in the company of these theorists. And so the 4 theories that we'll talk about today are challenge by choice, which comes out of experiential education realm and particularly project adventure. in the 70s. We'll talk about intersectionality, which comes out of race and critical theory world, particularly with Kimberly Crenshaw in the late 1980s. We'll talk about the personal is political, which comes out of student activism realms in the 1960s, and also feminism in the 1960s. And we'll also talk about the kind of most cutting edge element, which is brave space versus safe space. And we'll spend a bit more time on that because that's where we talk about risk management, as is the challenge by choice piece. And when we delve into brave space versus safe space, I'm going to introduce you to two cutting edge theorists who are doing this very particular work. George Yancey, who's a critical race theorist and professor out of Emory University, who talks about self-criticality and the idea of being unsutured. And also narrative imagination, which is from Martha Nussbaum, who is a classicist and ethicist at the University of Chicago. So let's get started with theory. So first I want to talk about challenge by choice. So this may be one of the more familiar theories to you. I'm going to ask for people to type in if you, and just bravely offer if you have heard of this theory or if you use it in your own realm. So I'll ask, even if it's almost like a virtual raising of hands, how many of you have heard of challenge by choice and are sort of using its tenets in your own trainings? So I'll wait for those to come in. So challenge by choice, again, comes out of, so I hear one person saying they use it in the outdoor ed program regularly. This is one of the first elements that people learned when talking about risk management. So challenge by choice came out of Project Adventure, which is an experiential education organization. People are saying they use it in environmental ed frequently. It came out of that in the 1970s, acknowledging that that there are challenges that can't be forced necessarily in education, especially experiential education, and that actually when people are able to choose what they participate in, that empowers them and also reduces risk. So I want to talk about challenge by choice. It sounds like many of you know about challenge by choice. Ella's saying environmental ed, other folks are saying in outdoor ed. The trick with challenge by choice in social justice trainings is that it assumes that there is a choice or that we've consented at all to the way that things are right now. And part of having brave conversations is acknowledging that within social justice realm and within sort of systemic issues, we acknowledge that things are not as they should be. And so the difference between challenge by choice in sort of the typical experiential education settings is that people can opt in or out of a situation. The issue with social justice trainings and working against systemic issues or systemic oppression is that we actually don't have a choice as to whether or not we've been born into these systems. The brave part of challenge by choice and where the sort of risk management comes in is that the conflict has in fact already occurred. So in other challenge by choice situations, let's say rock climbing, someone can choose whether or not they want to go up halfway or all the way up the wall. They can choose in environmental ed if they want to go into the bog walk, if they want to put on the waders and wade through the swamp. But in social justice trainings, the conflict is already there. We already live in a systemically unjust environment related to race and sex and homophobia and ableism and things like this. And so if we don't have a choice as to whether or not we've been born into an unjust system, then part of the bravery is acknowledging that. And part of the bravery is acknowledging that some of us were born into that system with privilege, which I'll talk about in different areas. And I'll talk more about that related to intersectionality. And so we actually come into this from a different orientation because the conflict has already occurred. And so often people say to me, some of my concerns in social justice trainings is that things will get out of hand, or that I'll say something wrong, or that it's going to blow up. And this is a point where I'll ask you to be brave and type in your own social justice oriented trainings, what are some of your concerns? Yourself as a facilitator, for the participants, what are some of your concerns or things that feel risky for you? Because I can tell you I do this for a living, and I always come into my programs with some concern. Now, when I say that conflict has already occurred, I mean that in a broad sense, in terms of sort of historic injustices and systems. And I'm going to give you a helpful metaphor for that before I talk more about bravery and what I do to address this, because I think it's a rather complex concept to say, look, we already live in an unjust world, and that's also kind of a letdown for folks. So this is an image of a moving walkway in an airport, and I'm going to share with you a theorist, Beverly Daniel Tatum, who some of you may have heard of, who wrote the book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? And she talks about this concept of a moving walkway, of what we're moving towards. So I'm going to read this for you. She says, I sometimes visualize the ongoing cycle of racism as a moving walkway in the airport. So again, image of this moving walkway. Whoops. Active racist behavior is equivalent to walking fast on the conveyor belt. The person engaged in active racist behavior has identified with the ideology of our white supremacist system and is moving with it. Passive racist behavior is equivalent to standing still on the walkway. No overt effort is being made, but the conveyor belt moves the bystanders along to the same destination as those who are actively walking. And again, that refers to a system that already exists. So what she says is, unless they are walking actively in the opposite direction at a speed faster than the conveyor belt, so kind of a speed faster, working against the status quo, unless they are actively anti-racist, they will find themselves carried along with the others. And so when I talk about challenge by choice, really the thing that we opt in on is working actively against this conveyor belt, because the conflict has already occurred. So I see people saying one of the fears is people not understanding that they have privilege. They work with a mostly white population. And I'm going to introduce some activities to you that, again, I focus really heavily on self-reflection and not necessarily so much on sort of performative or kind of large group movement and action. A lot of it is based on inner work. So I'm going to keep going now that you have this helpful metaphor, again, the moving walkway metaphor from Tatum. Okay, so as we move forward, we're going to talk about intersectionality in a moment. But what I always say, and this is related to the fear that people are either threatened or might not want to talk about their privilege, I always use myself as a brave example. And this is again where some of the bravery and courage comes in, because basically as a facilitator, I know that my job is to kind of put myself out there to model that bravery and vulnerability. Brene Brown does really good work on vulnerability and offering that. So in my trainings that I conduct, I hardly ever almost never start with vocabulary. I almost never start with asking people to get up or individually offer their own experiences. I almost always start with myself and talking about my own elements of privilege. I divulge elements of my own identity. I often choose to come out to the group to talk about that element of my identity. I talk about my whiteness, really frankly. I talk about my education level. I talk about my citizenship and the privilege that comes with that. And what I also do is when I talk about privilege, and somebody mentioned here, folks are feeling threatened that they are the problem and they don't know why the training's happening and they have to be careful or walk on eggshells about what they say. And so what I ask people to do in the training is typically someone in the training has some sense of what privilege is, or they have some definition. So what I ask them to do to, again, pull out the intensity of it is to say, when I say the word privilege, can you explain to me, as if you were going to explain to your 10-year-old neighbor what privilege is? Okay, so we pull out all of the personal element of it, we pull out all of the academic element and just say, and usually someone raises their hand. And so I actually don't explain the concept to them, but we pull it out from the group, and I'll talk more about that. So usually they say something like, again, because they're imagining themselves explaining it to somebody else that's not in the room, to their 10-year-old neighbor, they usually say, oh, it's an advantage that we didn't earn, but we have. And it usually is as simple as that. And so what I often say, especially when I start with myself and my own divulging and my own vulnerability, is I say, privilege is a fact. It's actually not something that we necessarily need to feel guilty about. It's unearned and we have it, and we get to choose how to spend it, which is actually exciting in some realms. And usually when people are able to sort of distance themselves from the guilt piece, we can talk about it as an opportunity. And this is where I want to move to in a moment, to intersectionality, to help us think about intersections of privilege and identity. I'm keeping an eye on the time. We're about halfway through. So one other thing that I do when I enter into a space, and we'll talk about brave space versus safe space, is I ask participants to free associate with the word safety and the word bravery. And I sometimes offer ground rules, but what I also say is shout out words that you associate with safety. And I'll read to you a couple of the words that people have come up with. They say warm, comfortable, home, still, simple. Okay. And then I shout out the word bravery, and they say courage, challenge, effort, risk, striving, or growth. And so I often say to them, look, we as a group actually already know what's required in this training together. And safety is warm and comfortable. But this training is an educational training, and it's meant to help us. It's meant to be a tool for us. I often start by saying, the same way that when doctors, they swear an oath to do no harm, we are swearing an oath together as educators to provide tools and education for our students. And we might not all be on the same page ideologically, or might not have all the same opinions, but what I'm offering today is tools to help us with the oath that we've sworn. So with that, I'm going to move into intersectionality, the second theoretical term. Now, this is a helpful concept that came out of actually law scholarship with Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw, who in 1989 coined it. And there's a video that I'm going to offer for you to be able to look at after this webinar. That is through Teaching Tolerance, which is an organization I write with through the Southern Poverty Law Center. It's a great, like a 3-minute video. It explains it really well. This is the point with the second theoretical concept where I'll ask any of you to type in, have you heard of this concept? Have you read about it? Does it feel confusing to you? I'm starting to see answers coming in. What do you know about intersectionality, and how do you use it in your areas? So I mentioned that I usually don't start with vocabulary. I usually start with myself, and I always start with activities that help with self-reflection. And so one person is saying, hey, I'm learning about this concept from you, and I haven't learned it in teaching yet. Well, great, thanks for sharing that. If other people are learning about it for the first time, please feel free to type that in, or if you've used it before, I'd love to hear about that. So again, a great video is through Teaching Tolerance. I'm not going to use the time to show that now, but it's a good clarification. Basically, Kimberly Crenshaw coined this term because she was doing work on how Black women were affected differently by the law than either white women or Black men. And she realized that there was not a way to talk about the intersection of different identity elements that differentiate the experiences of Black women from white women, excuse me, or Black men. And so what intersectionality points out is that each of us are made up of different elements of identity that cross over, intersect depending on context, that affect us differently depending on where we live, our age, where we experience privilege, where we may experience marginalization. And I'm going to show you an activity that I use called the identity grid that helps people to sort of believe that intersectionality exists. And in fact, and I think this will help with the person that talked about staff members being threatened by the idea of privilege, because it feels like, hey, well, I didn't ask for this. And what Challenge by Choice says is, it's true. None of us asked for this, but we're born into the system. The conflict already happened even before we were born. This is a system we're born into. What intersectionality does is to say, yes, we have different elements of our identity that give us privilege. And most of us also have some elements of our identity that marginalize us, or where we experience oppression. So I'm going to move into that activity now. So this is called the Identity Grid. I got this activity from the Wisconsin Women's Studies Consortium several years ago. It's a great experiential activity that I use. I will share it with you at the end. In general, I have listed different elements of identity, and basically, as you can read through the activities, people list or are allotted a couple of stickers or symbols where they are, I think they are allotted two, and they put the symbol into the square where it's true for them. So for instance, I often start with myself. I model myself, and this is an individual activity. I say, okay, I have two circles two shapes that I can put in. I say the parts of my identity that I'm least aware of on a daily basis. So what I usually model is I say, I'm going to put a circle shape in disability. I am a temporarily able-bodied person, both sort of physically and mentally, so I don't think about it very often. I'm least aware of it on a daily basis, and I'm often least aware of my my citizenship, because it's something that I was born with. I did not have to earn. Those are the parts of my identity I'm least aware of on a daily basis. And then I'll go into the next section and model. Here's where I model some vulnerability and bravery. I say a square is the parts of my identity that I'm most aware of on a daily basis. For me, I'm often most aware of my gender on a daily basis, often because I'm judged based on my gender or treated somewhat differently, both in professional and informal contexts, and I have to think about safety related to that. And then I'll often, it depends on the day for me, but often I'll say my sexual orientation, because often as a queer woman, I'm outside the norm, and I have to come out or not, or I have to think about what images are representative of me or not. So that's some of the vulnerability that I model. And often when people see me acknowledging these things about myself, it gives them permission to do that for themselves. This is a private activity. You're not showing it to anybody. There are reflection questions that I'll share with you at the end that people then do pair share in a group. But I very rarely, especially in these settings where they're quite vulnerable settings, I very rarely will ask someone to offer something if they haven't raised their hand to offer it. And I also have some ground rules about sharing, which is that we just share for ourselves. We don't report out from our group. We only share on our own experiences and what we've reflected on. And again, Dan is saying we'll share links to these videos and resources after the webinar. So this is one way that I help people kind of believe that intersectionality exists. Some of the questions that I ask after we've done this activity is, how have you talked about this in your family? What are some things that you noticed? Simple as that. And then they talk about it in a group. What I'm sure that you notice in these sorts of trainings is that very rarely are people willing to, or feel safe to, or even feel brave to share individually in a group about their individual experiences. Often the pair share element primes the pump for people to be able to do this. I'm curious if people are willing to share how many of you have had success with small group work with this, with pair share, and I'm curious about whether that works for you, how you, or if you have questions about how to manage your particular group or your particular size. Because as I'm seeing here, we each are coming from pretty different settings. And so what are some of the unique challenges that are presented to you in terms of kind of like your audience or who's going to be in your group? And I can help answer those. Again, so my question to you now to type in and report on is, what is the nature of your audience, and what are some of the challenges that are brought with that? So we have two more theories, and then we'll go into activities. So we talked about challenge by choice, we talked about intersectionality, and now I'll talk briefly about the personal as political. So what we learned about through the moving walkway metaphor and what we learned about through intersectionality is that diversity and inclusion and social justice is not just an individual interaction, right? It's not just me saying the right thing or the wrong thing in an interaction in a group or outside of the group or outside of the educational setting. It's actually part of a larger system that functions on all of us. And sometimes this can be overwhelming and sometimes this can be freeing. So it's overwhelming in the sense that oh, well, I'm just one person that's doing these trainings. We're just a group together that's working on this. How can we possibly start to work on an entire system that's existed for millennia? But on the same token, the kind of empowering piece of it is that we are each part of that system. And so even if we say, look, on an individual basis, I'm being nice to people, I'm being inclusive, I can also acknowledge, wow, there are some new things that I'm learning about the way that my upbringing, or the things that I do, or my legislators or my education system are also part of this. And once I realize that, I can start chipping away at it. So what the personal is political basically says is that each of our individual interactions are actually part of a larger system. So I may have a personal interaction with someone on the street, or I may have a personal experience in the line at the bank, or going into a training. But ultimately, it's not just about that individual interaction. That's only a symptom of a larger system. And so what critical race theorist and writer Bell Hooks would call that is imperialist, white supremacist, capitalist patriarchy. And basically what that says is we live in systems of power and privilege. And again, we were born into those systems. It was not a choice. We have privilege. We get to choose how to spend it. That's the optimistic piece. And so our personal interactions are actually symptoms of something political, meaning not political necessarily having to do with political parties, but having to do with power. So the personal is political. I get one person coming in saying that a challenge for them is that they have a group maybe only for a couple of hours, and it's difficult to get to a trust level where they're able to share things like this. At the end, I'm going to share some activities and some prompts that will help people get to those vulnerable spaces, but it may not be necessarily publicly reported. It may be that they're doing personal work. So even though as facilitators, we want to hear people share things publicly, that may actually be happening in the small groups or even individually. And for us to know that movement and learning is still happening, even if it's not happening in the sort of extroverted or public ways that we might be used to in other settings. So like for someone to experience the public joy of ringing the bell at the top of the climbing wall, that's really observable. It can be celebrated by the group. But in these sorts of trainings, often the learning is happening internally, personally, and sometimes with maybe one or two other people in the group. And so that's a distinction that we'll talk about when I get to the activities and when I talk to you about what's called the community of truth. So finally, the fourth concept, again, we talked about challenge by choice. We talked about intersectionality. We talked about the personal is political, and finally, brave space versus safe space. And this is the crux of what I want to talk about with you, and what I hope that we get to talk about in the question section as well. So a bit of a background about this. In 2013, this book came out, The Art of Effective Facilitation, and there were several great articles in it. It comes out of ACPA, which is a college personnel organization. And one key article that came out of it is called From Safe Space to Brave Spaces, a new way to frame dialogue around diversity and social justice. And this was in 2013. It was coinciding with the update of the Violence Against Women Act. It was coinciding with a lot of political moments and justice movements. And basically what Arao and Clemens are saying is, look, there's some conventional wisdom that we put together, especially when we put together kind of group agreements or covenants, that in the past we've said this training or this time ought to be a safe space. And the distinction that they're drawing is something that I mentioned in the beginning when I have people free associate the difference between safe and brave. And the distinction that they draw, and that I've done scholarship to sort of work further on, is that calling something a safe space, and particularly in an educational setting, which is different than physical safe spaces, which I'll talk about later. In an educational setting, saying that something is a safe space neither serves the dominant groups or the privileged groups, or what I'll call the superordinate groups in that setting, nor the marginalized or subordinate groups in that setting. And here's why. Basically, what they say, and what I've done scholarship on, is to say that if we say that this is supposed to be a safe space, and again, when people free associate, they associate that with comfort, home, quiet, cozy. That gives permission sometimes for the superordinate groups or the dominant groups that are present in those trainings to disengage when things become uncomfortable. So there's a difference. There's a difference between safety and uncomfortability, but often calling it a safe space when when things get a little funky or maybe a little tensiony or a little risky in the time, um, it basically gives permission for people to disengage and to say, look, we said that this was a safe space, and right now I'm feeling targeted. Or we said this was a safe space, and right now I'm feeling really uncomfortable, or like my identity is being put on the line. And ultimately, these educational environments are meant to, in some ways, reveal some discomfort because, again, we're bravely revealing a system that's already unjust. So on one hand, it does not serve the learning of people in the training. As someone mentioned, they're maybe often primarily white groups. It may not serve them because they may not be able to manage some of that discomfort or feel like they shouldn't be managing the discomfort when in fact that's part and parcel of these trainings. On the other end of the spectrum, for groups who frequently experience marginalization or what we call microaggressions, so things that happen throughout the day in small ways but systemic ways that either point out marginalization, that perpetuate grievances to them, or prejudices, the space is not going to feel safe anyway, right? So for people who are used to being on the margins, who experience that systemically, a training space is not necessarily a safe space anyways. It's very likely that people will say things in that space that will just repeat what they kind of have always experienced. And by calling it a safe space, that's saying, oh, it's supposed to be safe and it's supposed to be okay, but actually conflicts and bad things are still going to happen. And so it does not serve the superordinate group and it does not serve a subordinate group to call it a safe space or to function off of tenets like that. It serves us to call it a brave space and to acknowledge that conflict will happen, that for this particular, and when we say space, we mean an educational space, something that we're building together, not necessarily a physical space. In this time, we're saying, look, this is a distinct time and place that we've set apart for this education. And what someone says is actually sometimes they only have a few hours. And I actually think that's an asset because most people can only manage, sometimes including myself, can only manage to be in this that sort of brain or risk space for a couple of hours. And so what we say is we have designated this time as almost sacred, as a time that will be challenging, that will feel risky. Mistakes probably will be made. And then here's where I often model for myself. I often joke, hey, I've already made 4 mistakes in this presentation and I'm the presenter. And I do this for a living so that we can, and that kind of clears away the expectation that it's going to be easy, that people aren't going to make mistakes, that we're all going to know what we're doing all the time. But what it does say is, look, we've all committed in this time together to work on this. For this hour and a half, for this 3 hours, we've all sort of sworn that Hippocratic oath that I mentioned before. We've all sworn that we're going to be in this together. And that's the distinction of calling it a brave space. Now, I want to offer you 2 theorists before we close and open it up for questions that can help us with this. So George Yancey is a critical race theorist. You can look him up. You can Google him. He talks primarily about discussing race in the classroom, but also about power and privilege and in general. And he says that when we're having these conversations, we need to remain what he calls unsutured. Again, so it's process-based. We're not going to arrive at the end of this training at a conclusion. So he uses a medical metaphor of not suturing up the wounds. He says we need to acknowledge that there are systemic wounds that we were born into that exist, and that we need to address. So being unsutured involves a continuous process of renewal and commitment. There's no white self, again, he's talking about race, that stands clean or above the fray. And so he talks about this self-criticality, the looking inward, the self-reflection, as being something that is painful. I mean, he compares it to a wound that is left open and is still bleeding. And so that's also, I always say, look, bravery is required of this because when we do this self-reflection, often we may find things that we don't like or that we didn't realize. I'm curious for you to type in and for the chat to tell me who of you in a training that you've been in have come to a realization yourself that you may have sort of been part of a system. I certainly have. And what have the reactions been of people when they realize that maybe they have participated in something that they didn't know they were participating in? I can give two examples. Or one clear example is I've done LGBTQ ally trainings, and parents have come up to me afterwards who have said, and they've been crying. They've said, "Look, I I love my child. I am an ally. I'm doing everything I can um, to support my child, and I sort of found out through this training that there were some things that I'm doing that actually were doing the opposite, that were hurting." And what I always say to them is, look, when we're doing these trainings, bravery is required because we may discover these things, right, about ourselves. And that's where I go back to the why, the individual why that I talked about in the beginning, which is that when we realize that we're part of these systems, we can actually do things to work against them. We can move against the moving walkway. And so I always say with the second theorist before we close that there has to be some incentive for us to do these trainings. We're not just going to enter into these trainings and be like, well, today for an hour and a half, we're going to figure out how terrible things are. I always say, look, there's hope in these trainings because we have tools to work against these systems. When we acknowledge them, that means that we have tools to work against them. And so Martha Nussbaum, Dr. Martha Nussbaum, who's out of the University of Chicago, does a lot of work on this and what she calls narrative imagination. She's a classicist and ethicist there. And what she says is we have to build narrative imagination, which is we have to build what I have called radical empathy. So she says, quote, "This means the ability to think what it might be like to be in the shoes of a person different from oneself, to be an intelligent reader of that person's story, and to understand the motions and wishes and desires that someone so placed may have." And excuse me, often in social justice trainings, that happens, or people will show videos or examples of people who have been on the margins or who are oppressed or their stories. I do think that that works. I think what needs to happen first is the self-reflection, so people can say, okay, well, intersectionality is real, privilege is real, and even marginalization is real, and I experience these things. And so that helps for people to acknowledge that these are things that exist in the world. And then maybe they're able to see how they affect other people. And so some of that narrative imagination piece, that empathy building, needs to start from the self. And that's where I'll offer you just a few short activities, and we'll open it up for questions. So this is the activity section. What I want to emphasize, I present activities slightly differently because I follow theorist and writer Parker Palmer when he talks about teaching. In The Courage to Teach, he says, look, people ask me for tips and tricks about being a good teacher. They ask me for activities all the time. What he says is, actually, if we cultivate ourselves, our inner lives as teachers, our own confidence, if we do self-reflection as teachers, and build a community as students, then the activities in some ways will take care of ourselves. We'll already have the tools to build these activities. And so I don't start with, even though some people might say, well, what's the best activity? What can I offer? I do have a resource of helpful activities, but I always say we start with these theories. We start by being surrounded in a room of theorists who can help us so that we're not alone. And we build a community. And so I work with Parker Palmer. Well, I have worked with Parker Palmer, and I've written for the Center for Courage and Renewal, but mostly I work with this theory. This is the community of truth theory, which you can see here, which is to say that as experiential educators, also people that are doing justice work together, we know that we're not entering into a space, opening up people's brains, dumping in information, closing their heads, and then sending them away. What we actually are doing is acknowledging that there's already experience and knowledge in the room. And our jobs as facilitators is quite simply to pull out that knowledge, to say, look, we already know that there are experiences, that people have information about this that they maybe just have not been able to name, they don't have the vocabulary for. And so I list myself as a knower in this space, and we're all working on a common subject together. And I would propose that the subject in this case is social justice, is working against systemic injustice, and also Flattening out that power also, again, to address one of the issues that someone presented before, flattening out that power differential helps for people not to see themselves as a target of critique, but rather as a knower in the situation. And so I'm going to offer a couple tools for how I do that. And then we'll have a bit of time for questions. So closing up, I do use ground rules. I have an experiential focus. I'm going to quickly show you the Kolb cycle of experiential learning. I always have it be process-based. I work on empathy building, modeling bravery, and self-reflection. So this is the Kolb cycle of experiential learning. You'll have this resource at the end. And this is the time, as I show you these resources, as I'm closing the talking session, for you to take a look and think about what your questions are for the group. So Kolb cycle of experiential learning, we start with an experience, we reflect on it, we go abstract and add theory and talk about it, and then we experiment with it. Again, these are always process-based activities. They're never completion-based activities, and they always build empathy. One example I use is a group brainstorm and free association, which I mentioned. I have them free associate with the words bravery and safety. This is, they shout it out, or you could have them write it down. You could have a reporter from the group jot it down. I also use sentence stems, which comes from English and literature, so that people, if they don't know what to say, can simply free write and complete the sentence stem. I noticed that blank, I was surprised that blank, and they do some free writing for themselves. This also helps for the introverts in the group to be able to do some self-reflection. And in the bottom, I put some of the questions that I have people do in pair shares. Again, noticing some mindfulness even, noticing, reflecting on their own families. And this refers to the identity grid that I showed you before. What do you notice in your own grid? What happened in your own family? And again, I tell people you report out for your own things. What I also have them do as knowers in the group, going with Parker Palmer's theory, is I have them talk about their own takeaways and share their own takeaways with them. And that makes it less that I'm trying to push some information on them, and for them to say, look, here's how I'm responding to this, and here's how I want to apply it. And I always have them turn to a neighbor first and build classroom community by doing things like fist bumps, snaps. If ever anyone shares something, I almost always give them some affirmation or snaps afterwards, and that builds the pipeline for people to feel comfortable sharing. Oh, and one last thing that I want to share with you is a book that I really like is Experiential Activities for a Better World. It's by Marilyn Levin. It's going to give you sort of what people often say to me, like, but what are the activities that I can do? This is a great book for that. There's a lot of books that are like this. Okay. A couple of questions are starting to come in. Can you speak a little to, one of the questions is, can you speak a little to progressions? What do you do with a group that has no foundation in this work? How about a group you've already been working with for a while? What's the ideal outcome? Most of the groups, thanks for that question, and please keep the questions coming in. Most of the groups that I work with are 101 groups. Now that said, because of the increase in interest about social justice issues, there's always one or two people in the group that have done some of this work, either because they're interested in trainings or they've had it in college. And so almost always, if I'm presenting new topics, I ask if people in the group can present the vocabulary, actually. And I always say, present it as if you were talking to your 10-year-old neighbor, so that people don't feel pressure to be totally correct about it. And so people who have little foundation for this, I almost always start with the identity grid or other experiential activities. And this actually goes with the Kolb cycle of experiential learning. You start with the activity, then do the reflection, and then in the abstract conceptualization, you add in the theory. So you start with them, the self-reflection, and then later you add the theory. And the other thing I want to say is that when people do share out in the pair share, I never leave it just as them saying something, especially if they say something that's controversial. I always filter it through myself as a facilitator. And what I do is I mirror back to them. I say, here's what I heard. Does that sound about right? Or I say, here's what I heard, and here's the theory that it connects to. And so if someone's not quite getting that, they may have privilege in some area, or if they're saying, oh, I experienced this in terms of class and socioeconomic status, I can say, oh, this also applies when we're talking about racism and white privilege. And then with a group that I've been working with for a while, I have them do much more leadership. And then I also go meta. So I've done some train the trainer activities where I say, okay, well, how would you address this when you're going to be working with people you encounter? And then they talk about that as a group, and then they share, again, if we're thinking about the community of truth, Palmer's community of truth, they share how they would address it and how they would pull out knowledge from the group. And I find that to be particularly helpful. So the ideal outcome, frankly, what I often say and what I said to a camp recently is the ideal outcome is that we talk about this just as frequently as we talk about what's going to go in our trail mix or what we're going to have for lunch that day. We have to be talking about these things and openly, bravely, in order for them to be addressed. I'm going to answer one final question, and then I'm going to acknowledge that some of you may need to go at 4, but we're going to have a bit more time to go over with questions. Another question is, how do you address people who disagree firmly with change based on their own deep-rooted religious ideals? That's a great question. And how I particularly front load this is I actually start with I say, who has heard of the Hippocratic Oath and what does that mean to you? And usually people say, oh, it's from the medical community. They swear an oath to first do no harm. And then I ask people to jot down their why and what their oath might be in that training. And that's different with every place. I've done it in religious settings. Actually, many of my trainings are in religious settings. And so often they say, oh, well, what I've sworn to do is to share God's love and be a disciple. Or in a camp setting, it's to build leadership and to help children to feel like they have worth. And so what I say is, look, I expect that in this setting, there's going to be a wide breadth of ideologies, of opinions. I hope that, actually. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. What I am trying to do is to give you tools so that we can uphold the oath that we said we would do. We are going to come across these issues. That's not a question. We're going to come across these issues. And it doesn't matter whether or not we agree with them. What we've sworn to do is to address them. And so I always say, I'm not the, and that kind of pulls it away from me as the enemy trying to convince someone. It goes back to the community of truth of saying, I'm offering these tools for you to help you to uphold what you said, what we've sworn that we would uphold. And so I basically acknowledge that there's a breadth of opinions in the room. And I acknowledge that that's true in my own family, that's true in our country, because I'm not going to pretend like everyone's going to be on board with every concept. And I say that's okay. And that I often think that makes people feel heard and acknowledged in the room. Thanks for that question. Again, so I want to respect people's time. We're just at an hour now. So if you have to head out, I really thank you for being with me here today. Again, we talked about the why, we talked about some theory, we talked about some activities, and we're also addressing questions. If you have interest in this work, please feel free to contact me at Bridgebuilder Consulting, and my email is acn@bridgebuilderconsulting.com. And I do these trainings nationally. I'd be happy to come and do them with you. And I also do consulting phone calls if you want to address some particular issues in your orgs. So thanks again. And this is all going to be available at aee.org/webinars. And I will be sending resources to you that I've mentioned in this training. So if there are any other questions from people, I'd be happy to answer them. But if you have to head out, we'll see you later, and thanks so much. One other question that I often get as the other questions are coming in, one other question that I get is, well, what about the safe spaces, the designated physical safe spaces? And people are often referring to like Black student unions or LGBTQ campus centers or kind of identity-based spaces that are meant for people in that particular identity category. And what I say is, those are incredibly important. Those physical safe spaces are incredibly important spaces. And that's different than the educational spaces that are kind of in a moment in time that we build together. So the physical safe spaces, which are necessary and crucial, are different than the educational brave spaces that we build together, a structure, an educational structure that we build together. and both are necessary, right? One is, they have different goals. One is for rest and community and safety and calm and camaraderie, and one is for learning and challenge. So I have another question coming in. Again, if you have to head out, thanks so much, but we'll stay for a few more minutes to answer questions. One is, I would like to develop strategies for organization to take in order to make a space more inclusive. Any suggestions? That's a great question, and inclusion is such a big term, isn't it? So what I would say is to, and it's an organization. I'm not sure what kind of organization it is. Feel free to add more. I won't say your name, but just to say what kind of organization it is. Okay, they say it's a nonprofit. So what I would do is, first, before addressing strategies, I would take a step back and to say, okay, well, what would inclusion look like? What do we mean by inclusion? Also, what would some of the core goals be? So like, as organizations, again, I work with corporations and organizations all the time. What would be the milestones that you want to particularly address? So does that look like you want to hire more diverse candidates? Does that look like you want for particular programs that serve marginalized populations? Does that look like you want for people to just feel more able to be themselves? Do you want for people to, when they think of your organization, to say, wow, that's a really inclusive or progressive organization? I would say, when you say you want to be inclusive, there are lots of different benchmarks for what that could look like. And some of them are related to hiring or percentages. Some of them are related to stakeholder opinions of your organization. So you might want to do a focus group about what people think about your organization. And, some of them may be related to the climate, the cultural climate within your organization. Safe and comfortable for any okay, thanks for the clarification. They're saying, want it to be safe and comfortable for any non-white and non-cisgendered, so maybe trans people. So the other thing that I always recommend in ally trainings is to what I call bat signals, or ally behaviors. And so there are lots of different kind of markers or cultural markers that people will look for that indicate that it's an inclusive organization. When I do LGBTQ ally trainings, I say that can be as simple as having a rainbow flag on your website or on your backpacks, a statement of inclusivity. Does your organization have a mission statement or a statement about inclusivity, that if people Google it, they know that that's a key part of your mission? What do the photos about your organization show? And what I often say to people is, and again, I use the moving walkway model for this with Beverly Daniel Tatum. We actually have to be putting more energy towards inclusion and diversity programs if we want to see results in it, because our current system looks like non-inclusion. And so people often feel a bit uncomfortable saying, well, why would I put more resources, more time and energy towards recruiting diverse candidates, or towards being a more inclusive organization? That feels uncomfortable. Shouldn't it be kind of equal? And what I always say is, we've started from an unequal standpoint, and so we actively have to be building the pipeline and working against it. So what that looks like in a professional organization that I belong to is they wanted to have more women of color on their board and leadership and in leadership positions. And so over several years, they've put together a women of color leadership project, where they build a pipeline and cultivate women of color as leaders in their organization. And they put distinct time and energy towards that. They offer free and reduced scholarships to attend this professional organization. They have women of color only spaces. They have awards for women of color. They have more visit days. Again, so some people might say, well, look, that looks like affirmative action. I'm uncomfortable with that. And what I would say to that is the moving walkway model, which is that we are starting, especially within experiential ed. We know that within experiential ed, there are lots of ways that people have been blocked out, people on the margins have been blocked out of that historically, and based on who the leadership has been, all of those things. And so we have to actively be working against it, actively recruiting, actively putting time and energy towards inclusion and diversity. So again, to this person, I would say two things. One, suss out sort of what you're, maybe come up with 4 core goals of what inclusion would look like. What would the benchmarks be? And then the second part of that is committing time and energy towards those goals and feeling comfortable telling people about that and committing and communicating it and saying, look, we exist in a system that's unjust. We are actively committing time and energy towards addressing that. And that's who we are as an organization. Because Simon Sinek is a theorist on business theory, and he says people buy why we do things, not what we do or how we do them. And so that's why I started with why with all of you. And if you can communicate why your organization is the way it is to people, they will buy that and ultimately, hopefully, buy into it and participate in it. I see one more question. Oh, someone's saying thank you so much. I am gonna wait one more minute, and then we'll close this down. So if there are any other questions that people have, otherwise I will say again, thank you for being part of this webinar. And I recognize that this work is tricky, it's risky, and I thank all of you in your spaces where you are for doing this courageous work. It's not an easy realm. And it's so desperately needed, and we're all in it together. So I'm going to be continuing to present these things at AEE, and also online. You can follow me on social media at ACN Justice, click and like pages. I'm really happy to be an ally to all of you in this work. You're doing great work, and thanks so much.
Thank you, Anna, and you're doing great work as well. We really appreciate your time today. I got to say, you've turned a couple of paradigms on their head for me. The idea, one, that having a short amount of time can be an advantage in
Right.
social justice work. That's something I've certainly never thought before. And then two, sometimes a barrier, I think, is I'm not going to try to do this work because I don't think I can create a safe space. I don't know if I have the skills to do that. And to turn that one around and say, well, you're probably right.
Yeah.
You can acknowledge and work to create a brave space. It really changes the game, and I really appreciate what you're bringing to this community, what you're bringing to this work, and really appreciate your time today. I look forward to maybe doing another one of these with you in the future.
Thanks so much, everyone, and keep at it, y'all. See you later.